This evening's event brings together a wonderful panel of experts who have agreed to participate in what promises to be a very engaging and lively discussion of the book. We are delighted to have with us Dr Delia Cortese, who is Senior Lecturer in Religious Studies from Middlesex University. And from the Institute, we have quite a few people. We have Dr Omar Alí-de-Unzaga, Head of the Quranic Studies Unit, Dr Orkhan Mir-Kasimov, Senior Research Fellow in the Shi'i Studies Unit, Dr Yahia Baiza, Research Associate in the Central Asian Studies Unit, and of course we have our author, Dr Wafi Momin, who is also the head of the Ismaili Special Collections Unit. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr Fârès Gillon, Senior Research Associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, who will be moderating this evening's discussions. Please join me in welcoming Fârès.
Thank you, Nashin. Good evening to all. Thank you for joining us for this launch. So I thought I would start with a personal take on this book, because as a scholar of working on Ismaili texts, I find myself dealing with Ismaili manuscripts on a regular basis, as most of Ismaili texts remain, as we know, in manuscript form. In my approach, therefore, I tended to view manuscripts as mere tools to access a given book and produce a critical edition. However, through this book and through the discussions that I had with the scholars on this panel and with other scholars, I progressively started to measure the values of another approach in which the manuscript is not just witness of a text, but maybe an object of study in its own right. In other words, the study of a manuscript or manuscript tradition may yield much more results than simply allowing us to establish the best possible version of a book. It is indeed interesting to the wider study of communities, scribal practices, practices of transmission, etc. So this approach to manuscripts, which corresponds to the modern orientations of manuscript studies, is, I believe, one advocated in this book, which studies the specificities of manuscript traditions in Ismaili contexts. This has been made possible through the recent expansion of the field of Ismaili studies, a growth fed by an easier access to Ismaili manuscripts since the 20th century. As Dr Wafi Momin demonstrates in his introduction, and as he will probably tell us, the study of manuscript traditions is relevant not only to our knowledge of Ismaili texts, but more widely to our knowledge of Ismaili communities. We're happy to announce that this book is in open access, and this is the second book published by the Institute of Ismaili Studies in open access, both with IB Torres. The first one was Central Asian Ismailis, an annotated bibliography of Russian, Tajik, and other sources by Dagev Dagirolo, and it was published last February. Publishing open access books helps the IAS to fulfill its mandate in making our research and publications freely available to academics, to the Ismaili Jamaat, and other interested readers. In the future, we will be increasing our open access outputs for both new and previously published books, and I encourage the public to check the IAS website for updates in 2023. So before hearing our panelists, who will each briefly present their contribution to the volume, I turn to Dr. Wafi Momin with my first question. Could you please say a few words on your intentions and objectives in gathering contributions dedicated to Ismaili manuscript cultures?
Sure. Thank you, Fârès. And let me first of all extend a warm welcome to all the guests who are present here and those who are joining us online. So it's always, I've been thinking about this book's journey, and I think as an editor, it's always fascinating to go back and see what motivated the initial sort of impetus. And in gathering all those thoughts, I think few things need to be stated which are obvious. Of course, that this book came out of a symposium that Ismaili Special Collections Unit organized in 2017. October 2017, so we are talking about 5 odd years since then. And the symposium tried to look at its subject matter, the manuscript cultures of the Ismaili communities, which is really the theme. I think we will be using the word manuscript quite a lot, so I think it's useful to unpack this word a little bit. I suspect that some of you may not be familiar with these nuances that are involved when we use words like manuscript cultures, manuscripts. So I think the easier way to explain what is a manuscript is, when we tend to think of modern books, you think of books that we normally buy from bookshops, Amazon, and we may even talk about books which are available digitally, which we can upload on our devices, download, make available like the open access platform, which this book tries to do. But this is not how necessarily the books transmitted or moved around in pre-print era. And what we had at that time, of course, that each and every book that we think of at that time was manually written. So if you think of a book, let's say of a Quran that we can go and buy, obviously every book is going to be same because they've been produced, in thousands of print runs. But that is not the case when we look at the pre-modern world, even if we are dealing with the same text. So a manuscript of a Quran may have the same text if we grant the scribe the benefit of the doubt that he or she would have copied it faithfully. Even then, the context, the personal circumstances of that particular copyist, the environment, his or her affiliations, all of those things make that one copy unique. And I think that's something very important that we tend to forget when we talk about books. So that's what the manuscript is. And the immediate implication of that is that when we tend to think of books in the modern context, we tend to think of text as fixed sort of, artifacts. So we have the same text across all the versions of the books that we go in and buy, be it of novel or whatever. But that is not necessarily the case when we look at the world of the manuscript. So, and of course, another implication that I can immediately relate to is that when we think of this pre-modern world of books and knowledge transmission, we are talking about really a number of agencies involved and a number of processes and practices and institutions involved. So immediately we can think of the role of the scribes and the copyist, who would copy each and every manuscript. We would have, in many cases, patrons, because sometimes to produce a lavishly produced manuscript, you would need rich patrons, and you would need illuminators, calligraphers, commentators, translators. And with that, we have this whole issues of knowledge transmission, circulation, and of course, the institutions and networks that sustain those processes. So, going back to the question that Fârès posed, Institute has done amazing work in researching the manuscripts that we have at the Institute, especially in trying to make available text so that research can really progress. And many of you would know about Ismaili Text and Translation Series, for instance, which has produced a great number of texts. But I felt, going back to that time, that I think there was also a need to engage in a conversation about those larger questions of transmission, scholarly networks, intellectual networks that were producing that knowledge, that were producing those texts. And not only that, in that process, how does that world of pre-modern book production challenges our modern day notions of text? When we tend to think of text as fixed sort of artifacts, but that is not necessarily the case. And why do we have different versions of text? Is it that we can always arrive at the perfect text at the end of the day that we can then use for our interpretive or historical work? Or there is something more to that? And then what about, the larger questions of interactions that are happening among different communities? How do we see through the lens of manuscripts different ideological boundaries being broken? So there were a number of questions that were really at the heart of it, and hence the idea started through the conversation of many of the colleagues who are in the audience and here. And the symposium then really aimed to provide that platform to a number of scholars who were engaged in those conversations. And out of the 21 papers that were presented, I'm pleased that 18 of those papers were adapted then and then now are available in this form. So, there are a number of issues that one would encounter in this book, which really looks at primarily the case of the manuscript cultures nurtured by the Ismaili communities in different times, in different contexts, all the way from the beginning, that is to say, the early sort of history of the community's evolution, all the way to the modern times. And this is something very fascinating, that when we look at the manuscript cultures of the Ismailis, we don't see that it stopped once the printing facilities became available from the 19th century on a large scale. Many of the Ismaili communities continued to produce manuscripts, and that, of course, begs its own question, why? So it looks at the entire spectrum and a number of issues, and obviously some of those issues you'll get to hear from the panelists who are here, especially from the lens of what they deal with. So I hope I've tried to give a sense of what the book is about and how it tries to tackle questions.
Absolutely, thank you, Wafi. I will now ask a question to each of the panelists in the order in which they appear in the book. So I'll start with Dr. Omar Alí-de-Unzaga. So you study in your contribution a manuscript of the Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa, a manuscript that was not used for the critical edition and translation of the Epistles published by the Institute of Islamic Studies, if I'm not incorrect. And you attempt to highlight its importance. So how do you evaluate the importance of this individual manuscript, and to what extent can an individual manuscript shed specific light on a certain work?
Okay. I want the audience to imagine the year 1546. 1546. That's the year 953 of the Hijrah. That's the year in which Humayun conquered Badakhshan. The year in which Trinity College was founded in Cambridge. Okay. That's the year of when my manuscript, the manuscript that I have studied in this volume, was copied. By the time we published the article, it was the 10th oldest complete copy of the Epistles in the world. Now more manuscripts have been identified, so I think now it stands at the 12th or so, 12th oldest. But still quite an old copy, quite complete. It had been catalogued by Professor Cortese in the catalogue of manuscripts. And I found it in the collection of the IIS, in our special collections. And I was curious to look at this one copy, and so I started to think, what is the value of looking at one specific copy of a work? Okay? If you have a work, the same work, copied many times, what is the value of looking at one specific copy? You want to look at maybe differences, is there anything unique? Can you see relationships between this one copy and other copies? And in this case, I was interested to know whether there was any similarity to the so-called editions. Okay, so when you publish a manuscript, you have an edition. Sometimes we call it critical edition if you compare different manuscripts, and you have annotations. Some editions are not critical in the sense that they don't include an apparatus or they don't include footnotes. So I requested a sabbatical leave, half a sabbatical actually, to do research on one of the epistles, Epistle 9, which is Epistle on Ethics, which I have now submitted and should be published soon. But I, in the process of looking at various manuscripts, I found this one manuscript. And I spent 3 months of my 6-month sabbatical to devote my time to this one article, okay, which became one of the largest articles in the volume. And I did that because I'll tell you what is the state of the published text of the epistles before the IIS joined forces with Oxford University Press to publish our new critical edition. The text was available since 1887. It was published in Bombay. The publisher, Nuruddin Ibn Jiba Khan, tells us that he found a very old manuscript, and that's all he tells us. Okay? That's not enough. We don't have a number, we don't have anything. Okay? He published the text beautifully in 4 volumes. 30 years later, someone came along in Cairo in 1927 and basically plagiarized that text and published as their own. Okay? Not as their own, but in their own name. Okay? This was Khairuddin al-Zirikli, a journalist, and published the text. But what he did is he had nice paper as opposed to the old yellow paper that was used in Bombay. He divided the text into different paragraphs, and he added punctuation. So it looked like a modern text. It is exactly the same text. This Cairo journalist who plagiarized the Bombay edition, he also took a very obscure edition that had been published in Cairo some years earlier, and he mixed both editions for part 1. By mixing, I mean that he chose the chapter titles from the Cairo older edition and the text of the Bombay edition. Okay. But no acknowledgement. 30 years later, 1957, we go to Beirut. Another so-called edition comes out with a nice introduction by scholars, a better production. It is exactly the same text. Okay. So the one edition back in 1897, published in Bombay, was reprinted, perhaps in a slightly better with slightly better typesetting. But it was the same text. So scholars were asking, what is the manuscript that was used for these editions? We didn't know if these were different editions, so I did some comparison. My working conclusion is that these editions are one edition, the Bombay edition, and that it comes from one manuscript. And I was greatly surprised when I discovered that the manuscript in our collections is by far the closest copy, the closest manuscript in the whole world, as far as we have identified in accessible libraries, that comes closer to the Bombay edition. I don't want to go into the details, okay? But this happens at the micro level, at the choice of words and variants, okay? So when you're looking at line by line and word by word, you have to compare, manuscript with manuscript. In this case, I was comparing one manuscript with other 30 manuscripts that I have access to, and with these editions. I'll just close my intervention by giving you some numbers. I did some maths when Wafi was speaking, and this is a manuscript just to give you a visual representation of what it is. It is in 2 volumes, and it has a total of 737 folios. That's a lot of folios. Okay? A folio has 2 pages. Okay, the recto and the verso. So if you multiply 737 by 2, is 1,474 sides. Okay, we would call them pages. Each page has an average of 21 lines. Okay, so that is 30,900 lines, and there are about 13 words per line. So that is 400,000 words. Right? That is the corpus of the epistles, and that is what I compared in 30 manuscripts and the edition. So that was 3 months' work, okay? But it took me day and night, and very little eating. And in the end, the result is the article that you have in this volume. So I hope the maths has given you an idea of the kind of work that we tend to do.
Thank you very much, Omar. And Yes, very, very impressive work. So my next question is for Professor Delia Cortese. So your article deals with manuscripts of Majmu' al-Tarbiya, a text belonging to the Tayyibi tradition. And you were particularly interested in the reading practices and practices of knowledge transmission that one could infer from the careful study of the manuscripts of this text. So my question is, how does your study of this work shed light on the uses of manuscripts and their role, both in the community and for the transmission of knowledge?
Thank you very much, Fârès, and thank you very much for making me part of this fantastic project, Wafi. Thank you. In my contribution, I concentrate on the analysis of 12 Arabic manuscripts that are here in the library of the Institute. And these are manuscripts of a work that is best known as the Majmu' al-Tarbiya. This consists of a collection of texts assembled in the 12th century in Yemen for pedagogical reasons, for pedagogical purposes, for the use within the Tayyibi Ismaili Dawah. The authorship of the Majmu' is commonly ascribed to a 12th century Tayyibi scholar called Muhammad al-Harisi. Within the Tayyibi Ismaili literary tradition, the Majmu' constitutes the first major example of a genre. The idea of collecting texts and putting them together. And then after this major work, more examples have followed within that literary tradition. The text was assembled in a format that can be described as a multiple text manuscript. Now, as object, as literary object, you mentioned the idea of thinking about manuscripts as object earlier on first. As object, the manuscripts I consulted are sort of belong to the handwritten heritage of the Dawoodi Bohra community of mostly 19th century India. There are some that are earlier and some that are early 20th century, but the bulk of most of these 12 manuscripts are from the period. So many copies of this work are now available in libraries around the world, whether private or public. But I have only centered about used the manuscripts here within the Institute's collection, and they come in 2 volumes. The set comes in 2 volumes, volume 1 and volume 2, and this is an interesting phenomenon because apart from one set, they are all split sets. Only one set is kind of volume 1 and 2 from this by the same copies. The others are all mixed, which kind of reflects a kind of a tradition within the Dawoodi Bohra community to, at the moment of death within families, the volumes would be split among family members, irrespective of whether the volumes came together as a unit or not. So we have this dispersed copy that found their way back together here. Content-wise, the Majmu' includes some 51 different texts of various lengths. And a number of these texts are from this person I mentioned earlier on, this Muhammad al-Harisi. Most of the works belong to the Fatimid literary canon between the 10th and the 12th century. So far we have varied Fatimid time works assembled in Yemen, in Tayyibi environment in the 12th century, and then this text has been transmitted, and within the Fatimid text containing it, through the centuries up until the 19th century within the Bohra community of India. So we have really span of time and transmission happening here. Now, these are complex texts because they are made of different, texts added together, and for this reason, multi-text manuscripts, Islamic multi-text manuscripts, are not very much studied. There are only very few studies that have been done within the field of Islamic comicology, Islamic studies of manuscripts. Why? Because there is a tendency to focus maybe on extracting this one treatise, this one text within the collection and concentrate on that one and, edit, publish, work of it. And this is, unfortunately, this is great, but it is at the expense of the wider contextual format that contains the text, that says a lot about the text itself, but also the culture that surrounds it. So in my paper, I begin with a discussion about how to categorize this type of manuscript that, though forming one unit, contains multiple texts. So I explored various terms and why I thought they were not particularly suitable, like miscellany, compilation, anthology. And then I found that through the help of other studies or colleagues in this field, I found that multiple text or multi-text, or perhaps even better, corpus organizer is a more appropriate way of describing these collections. Corpus organizer gives you a sense of like a mini library that you carry with yourself. So all this, so it is quite a useful term, expression. Okay, then I looked at the role and responsibility of the compiler. Attention, not the author. We are talking about a compiler here because this is someone who doesn't intervene, interject, or adds to the text. He just puts them together. Now, so why role and responsibility? So what's wrong with compiling, assembling text like this? Well, within the context of a Tayyibi Bohora community where authority, temporal and spiritual, rests on the exclusive control of knowledge, control of its transmission, and control of its content, the compiler becomes an editor who has influence in determining what goes into this compilation and what stays out. What to, which extras to make and what to summarize. So the compiler determines the trajectory of learning. This is a pedagogical work, so he's taking decisions here. Where does he take this material from as well? How does this person work in deciding what to put together? And most importantly, on the basis of which authority? Who gives him the right to make that selection? We don't know. It is not explicitly there. So I raise all this question. It's very important because actually this Majmu'at Tarbiyah, most of the texts that are in there, we know about them because they are transmitted through this corpus organizer. This is the only version that we know of this text that are there from the Fatimid period that reached us through this. But others have been left out, and some, have been included. So, who was the intended audience for this Majmu'at Tarbiyah? Well, I'll use the words of the person who has made the compilation, who I quote. Says in the introduction, made my work a bit easier here. It says, I've gathered in this book the sciences, the reading of which is necessary for the knowledge of the matters of the rightful dawah, the worship and acquisition of happiness, and I've placed in it, from that, what is the summary and the detailed. This is about, this is what you really need to know if you want to know about, the matters of the Dawah. This is a kind of a must-read text, okay? So, what is the reader's response? how should this book be approached? Is it something that only the top levels of elite scholars should read, or is it for anyone who wants to, let's say, have answers about questions of knowledge or doctrines, etc.? And then there is another. How do you read a collection of texts like this? Do you start from the beginning and then go up page after page, till the end? Or do you just use parts of it to answer specific questions and address specific issues? Is there a particular method of reading it in that it should be read within learning sessions, or has the reader a certain autonomy in reading it? Okay, where do I find the answers to these questions? I find the answer to the questions, thankfully, in the fact that, as we all do, sometimes we write notes in books and things, and in the manuscript I did find these notes of people who use them. And we call these notes paratext. It's a manuscript which has a text and handwritten notes around it. So it's composed of two sections, text and paratext. And so from these notes, we hear the voice of the user's response, the user experience of reading it. Also, I found in other texts out of kind of annotations and comments by people who used the Majmua in their own learning, or notes written about them. Perhaps the most famous of these scholars who comments on his experience of reading this text is a 16th century scholar called al-Bahuchi. He was from India, went to Yemen to learn with the Tayyibi spiritual leader, let's say. What we find that the text needs to be approached in a particular way. It needs to be learned by heart through repetition. It's a master read book that is actually the third within the reading list of esoteric books that need to be read. It's the third one after Kaganaman and Kirmani. This is the third. So this is an important book. Then we go further and we find that this book is still ranking high, but it ranks number 6. Okay, so it's coming down a bit, but it's still very important. So if you want to have your kind of knowledge in esoteric text, the 6th book you have to read in a particular order is this one. And then we reach the 19th century. We have this reading list compiled from the authorities among the Bahara spiritual leadership, and the book has disappeared. It's no longer there. So there are this list, and this book has lost its power, its importance, its relevance, and so why that is the case? Well, you'll have to read the article to find out.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So basically, we have one work, 12 manuscripts, many voices that come out, which tell us these manuscripts are not living documents. So we have sourcing, conception, assembling, writing, copying, distributing, reading, annotating, and cataloging. So that's a work in progress.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So my next question is for Dr. Orkhan Mir-Kasimov. Your contribution discusses the presence of Sufi manuscripts from the Na'matullahi Tariqa Ismaili collections and to be more precise, in the collections held by the Institute of Ismaili Studies. So what would you say is the relevance of this fact to the Sufi-Ismaili relationship on the one hand, and for manuscript studies more widely on the other hand.
Yes, thank you, Fârès. And I must say that I owe this article project entirely to Wafi, because Wafi attracted my attention to these Ni'matullahi manuscripts in Ismaili collections, provided me the actual manuscripts, and even helped me to establish a contact with the community in Badakhshan, with a person who could give me some lights on how these manuscripts are actually seen by the community. Before I start talking about this article, I just wanted to say that we sometimes at least, we tend to think about Islamic groups and movements in clear-cut categories. Like here are the Shi'is, here are the Sunnis, here are the Sufis, and here are the jurists. Here are the Mu'tazili rational theology, and here is the tradition. But in real situations, we often find that this kind of categorization doesn't work. And there are many examples to that. For example, we have something that is called Sunni Shi'ism. What is Sunni Shi'ism? There are Sunni authors who praise the Ali ibn Abi Talib and Shi'i Imams. We have something like Shi'i Sufi Brotherhood. How this is possible. And we have, of course, the Shia appropriation of the Sufi esoteric doctrines. So in real life, it seems that the borders which delineate the different identities are much more porous and flexible than this strict categorization. And I'd say that it is an important fact that should be taken into consideration, because otherwise we only see the main categories and then we relegate everything else like the marginal event or a kind of exception. But I think that on the contrary, maybe these very clear-cut categories are exceptions, because we always have some kind of a mix, some kind of exchange and interaction, so that pure categories could be less, maybe less viable option than this kind of the more eclectic entity. And yeah, I can continue on that for a long time, but it's better to go into to go closer to the subject of the article. So what I wanted to say is that the study of the manuscripts gives us an insight into these fluid identities, into the flexible borders of identity of different groups. And one of these examples is the preservation of Ni'matullahi manuscripts in Ismaili communities, in particular in Ismaili community in Badakhshan. So in my paper, I was working on this Ni'matullahi manuscripts, and the question that I wanted to clarify was why they were, what can explain the preservation of these manuscripts by the Ismailis. There are, of course, several possible explanations which are on the surface. Like we know that at least from the 18th century there was a close friendship between the Nizari Ismailis and the Ni'matullahis. But if we look at the friendship, well, it's okay, they were both persecuted groups in Iran. So they got close to each other, protected each other when it was possible. But it doesn't explain the interest for the doctrinal works. So why didn't they just remain with their own doctrines, with their separate sets of books? There is also an idea of taqiyya. You know, that the Ismailis would adopt Sufi teachings because they, after the Mongol invasions, they had to hide their true identity. And they used the language of Sufism to express their ideas. Okay, but this I didn't find totally satisfying either, because it doesn't look that the works of Shah Ni'matullah Wali were used as a cover for something. They just circulated in the community as such. So what kind of reason we can find? And I think that it goes, we need to look at it in the context of the interactions between Shi'ism and Sufism in general, especially at the period that followed the Mongol invasions. We have, of course, on the side of the Shi'ism, Twelver Shi'ism, for example, an exceptional interest for the Sufi teachings, because the trend which dominated in the Twelver Shi'ism after the occultation of the 12th Imam was rather a juridical and rationalist trend. So the esoteric teachings of Shi'ism were in the shadow of this rationalist and jurisprudential trend. And then in the period after Mongol invasion, there is an increased interest to restore the esoteric dimension of the Twelver Shi'ism. And the Twelver Shi'i thinkers turn to Sufis. And at that time, there is a theory that all Sufis were the disciples of the Shi'i Imams, and therefore the Sufism actually represents the Sufis preserved the authentic teachings, esoteric teachings of the Imams, and now they can be adopted back into the Shi'i Islam. The figures, the characteristic figures of this tendency are people like Haydar Amori, for example. And then there is, of course, what is specific to the interaction between Ismailis and Sufis is that the loss of the Ismaili libraries there was the interest to restore again these lost esoteric teachings. And so probably this explains also particular Ismaili interest for Sufism. Yes, so this was a kind of atmosphere of Sufi-Shi'i rapprochement, in which it is not surprising that the Ismailis, for example, considered the authors such as the mystical poets such as Sana'i, Farid al-Din Attar, Jalal al-Din Rumi, and thinkers like Aziz al-Nasafi as expressing their own doctrines. You know that this rapprochement is also stimulated by many shared basic ideas between Shi'ism and Sufism, such as idea of the spiritually inspired guide, idea of the Valaya as a kind of a divine guidance, divine election, which establishes a particular bond between God and some of the human beings who become the spiritual leaders of the community. And then, of course, the general veneration of figure of Ali ibn Abi Talib by Sufis and by Shi'is alike. But what was specifically, so why specifically Shah Ni'matullah Wali's works? Why it is that it was the Shah Ni'matullah Wali's works that were preserved in Ismaili community? Again, of course, there could be this idea of close friendship between the two communities, Ismaili and Nimatullahi, that developed from the 18th century. But I think one of the main things is that the works of Shah Ni'matullah Wali contain the formulations of some ideas, some Sufi ideas, but put specifically into the Shi'i vocabulary, which might have been perceived as particularly close by the Ismaili community. I can give you a few examples.
I think we're running out of time, but maybe one minute.
2 or 3 minutes. So just to give you some of the examples from these manuscripts that are preserved in the community, and you will recognize probably the ideas which resonate with Ismaili thinking. Shah Ni'matullah Wali calls himself the locus of manifestation of sincerity. He calls himself infallible, Masum, and he calls himself Light of Ali. He is the cup-bearer of God. He is the minstrel of God, and he is divinely appointed representative of the 12 Imam. So he is the son of the real and the real himself. He is the teacher of the prophetic law. He is the mirror reflecting the Walaya of Ali ibn Abi Talib. So this is just to give you a taste of the contents of the Ni'matullahi manuscripts preserved in the community. And to finish, just one thing I wanted to say, that of course it is interesting to study the Ismaili manuscripts, which are preserved in Ismaili collections. But there is a particular interest to study non-Ismaili manuscripts, which preserved in Ismaili collections, because it gives us an insight into the interactions between the Ismailis and other community and trends within Islam. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will now hear Dr. Yahia Baiza. So your contribution is dedicated to an unpublished work, The 7 Pillars of the Sharia, which is one of the most copied texts in the Central Asian Ismaili context. So how would you evaluate the importance of this work in Central Asian communities, and how can your study of the manuscripts of this work help evaluate this importance?
Thank you very much. If I can put these questions in the concept of knowledge and how these manuscripts preserve knowledge and how they transmit knowledge, I think that would be a very interesting kind of entrance into the question that you asked. To start with a kind of a general statement, all human civilizations are due to the contributions that the manuscripts have been making, whether it's our current digital knowledge, digital era, which we sometimes call the fourth industrial revolution, whether it's digital books, digital platform that people can access right now, this book launch, digital economy, digital currency, or whether it was like the third industrial revolution, the internet, the rise of globalization and new liberalism, or the printing press, and all these things are because of contributions that the manuscripts have been making. And the reason for that is that because manuscripts are containers and carriers of knowledge. And that also applies to this particular manuscript that I have analyzed and contributed to this volume, the 7 Pillars of the Sharia, or Haft Arkan Shariat. And when we talk about manuscripts and knowledge, the there are several layers that we have to take into account. One is that the manuscript itself, I'm talking more about this, my example would be related to these 7 pillars of the Sharia, the manuscript. That when we talk about the knowledge preservation, is that one is that the manuscript itself holds this knowledge about the 7 pillars of Sharia. Again, that's not everything what this manuscript holds. What is more important is that what knowledge the 7 pillars of the Sharia themselves, what knowledge do they hold? And also when we talk about, so one is that the manuscript itself is a vehicle of carrying knowledge, and then the 7 pillars of the Sharia, each pillar is a carrier of knowledge in itself. And of course, neither the manuscript nor the 7 pillars are the end goal of these manuscripts. And then when we talk about knowledge in the context of manuscripts, we need to think about the language, the source language of these manuscripts, which is Persian, because these were in the Central Asia, in Badakhshan, Tajikistan in particular, but at the time Badakhshan of Afghanistan was also part of the same region. So in these manuscripts, some of them were produced in the 18th century, some of them were in 19th century, but some of them in the 1970s as well. Now we see that in Tajikistan, you have from the Second World War onwards, Persian as a language of education, language of religion, and generally as the lingua franca in Tajikistan is in decline, while Russian and Cyrillic script is on the rise. So now language is a mechanism that facilitates and gives access to this knowledge, but at the same time, losing Persian language also prevents the people to whom these manuscripts were intended and were produced, doesn't give them the access. And now these manuscripts are very much in the hand of the religious teachers, be they khalifas or peers or other religious teachers in the area. And then when we talk about these manuscripts and the knowledge that they carry, these are the Ismaili manuscripts, and in the Ismaili manuscripts, particularly when it comes to the religious texts, the interpretations that they give of the 7 pillars of the Sharia is esoteric interpretation, which we call it the ta'wil. And those of you who know the word ta'wil is a second form of awwal, which means to return something back to its origin. And when we talk about ta'wil, we automatically also think of tafsir, but I will not talk about tafsir too much, but tafsir is like from Fârès, which means to explain something. It's more like to deal with the exoteric aspect of the Quran or whatever religious text that may be, where ta'wil, though ta'wil and tafsir are interdependent, but they are very different from each other, because tafsir doesn't take to the origin of a thing, but ta'wil intends to take things back to the origin. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier, these manuscripts, on the one hand, they themselves are carriers of these knowledge, and then the 7 pillars of the Sharia, each pillar itself is a carrier of a specific form of knowledge. And then that specific form of knowledge that is interpreted through Sharia, through ta'wil, is all about that revolves around the concept of Ismaili imamate. Because in the Ismaili tradition, ta'wil is not possible. You can't learn ta'wil simply by learning it somewhere in a school or in madrasa, anywhere. It has to come from the imam's teachings. So therefore, it's a very specific and it's very particular, because as Nasruddin Tusi says, that the office of imamate is the perfecter of religion, because it encompasses both ta'wil and tanzil. As Nasr Khusraw says, that the shariats of prophets are many, but their ta'wil and the meanings are the same. Just to give an example of these 7 pillars of the Sharia, Qazi Miman in his Da'im al-Islam, or the pillars of Islam, also talks about extensively about these 7 pillars of the Sharia, and Nasruddin Tusi also in his Matlub al-Mu'minin, there's a diatom of faithful also talks about it. And so the first pillar in Tazin Iman's Dawah al-Islam is wilayat, and then the second one is taharat. Wilayat means that originally in kind of linguistically it means something that comes after something else. That's how it means in Arabic, although it has many other meanings as well. But something that comes after something else. So in this case, imamate comes after the prophet, so that's why the term wilayat stands for. And then it's taharat, which means cleansing, and salat, which means prayer, zakat, and fasting, and hajj or pilgrimage, and jihad. Nasruddin Tusi also talk about the same thing, except that he replaces shahada with wilayat. But actually, the meaning of the same are the same. But only the difference is that the Qazin Imam's half arkan Sharia or 7 pillars of the Sharia is very extensive, whereas Tusi's is very short. I'll give you just one simple example how this whole knowledge and the ta'wil works in these manuscripts. Let us say, just as an example, the first pillar, which is shahada or testimony. So in the shahada and testimony, the manuscript says that La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. So it's also known as shahadatayn. So La ilaha illallah is that it establishes the monotheistic kind of foundation of Islam, and Muhammad Rasulullah is the shahada that is the root origin of the Prophet Muhammad's prophetic kind of authority. Now, from the Ismaili perspective, ritualistic repetition of this shahada or testimony is not enough. Although for becoming a Muslim, it is enough. Anybody who pronounces this by tongue, it's enough that person is Muslim, but the person will hold Shi'i, Sunni, or any type of interpretation. That's not the kind of, it doesn't matter anymore because the person is a Muslim. However, from the Tawilic or from the esoteric interpretation, it is not enough to say this ritualistically. You have to understand the meaning of it. So once these manuscripts starts talking about that for example, it says, La ilaha, there is no God, so it is a denial, which is a nafi. So how do you know that there is no God? And then if you say that there is only one God, that comes to isbat or affirmation, how do you know that there is a God? So once in the beginning you say there is no God, you deny, and then you say there is a God. So how do you combine this with the controversial issue? So that's how that it says that you can only understand this if there is a truthful teacher or true teacher or the Imam of the time can tell you why there is no God in the beginning of this shahada, and then there is a God in the second part of the shahada. So this is how this manuscript begins to talk about this. So I don't think so there is a right time for me to enter into all this debates because that would be a very long discussion. But what the manuscripts is basically saying is that in order to understand the Imam's teaching itself, now it enters into a deeper layer of this esoteric knowledge in this manuscript. You have to disavow tabarrud, disavow falsehood, anything that doesn't fit with the right interpretation of religion. You have to take distance from that, and then you have to accept or do tawallah to the truth, whatever that truth is. So basically, it's like again, like you move away yourself, and basically that's kind of the nafi or the denial part of the shahada type of thing, if you like. And then if you accept the teaching of the Imam, it's like you come close and you accept the affirmation. So that's kind of an example of this type of esoteric interpretation of the 7 pillars of the Sharia. As our colleagues said, that if you want to know more about the rest of 6 pillars, read. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we're running out of time, so I will just give back the floor briefly to Dr. Wafi, who will speak about his contribution to the volume, which deals with the scribal culture in the Satpan's manuscript culture.
Okay, thanks. Very briefly, I think I'm mindful of the time. So, one of the areas where I've been working on for quite some time is really the history of the Ismaili tradition in South Asia, and especially during the era of colonial period, i.e. roughly from 19th century onwards, it was quite striking for me as I read more and more of colonial records, is how there was a certain kind of image that came out of those sources when it came to the community. So, and slowly I started to detect a pattern there. So it briefly went like this. So whenever they would talk about Khojas and other sort of members of that larger sort of group, they would be immediately identified as a class, caste, or tribe of merchants who have made a name for themselves. Everywhere they have gone, they have really, excelled in this whole craft of trade. But at the same time, another sort of image will go along with it, which is that when it comes to their religion, they don't know much about Islam. They have a rudimentary knowledge of Islam. They are somewhere halfway between, Islam and Hinduism, and it almost sounded to me that because they are businessmen, merchants, and hence they have nothing to do with Islam, or they don't care a lot about it. And I give some examples, some very juicy ones which I loved, where the judges and all of those went on to make some comments. I think they make for a very interesting read in 21st century. And then, curiously, as I one of the tasks that I've been engaged is to really catalog this collection of certain manuscripts together with my team. Something struck me, which is what Delia talked about, paratextual elements in a manuscript. So when you pick up a manuscript, immediately your attention is grabbed by the text. In this case, these are the texts of the Ginans, which are compositions relating to their devotions, dealing with religious matters and all of that. But my attention particularly was grabbed by the voices of the people who were actually copying those manuscripts. And they were on the margins. And that's where I focused on in this contribution. Now, curiously, if you want to know about who copied a manuscript, what was the background of that person, which class that person came from, you don't normally find sources talking about them, right? Because, we don't have sources dealing with the people. So where do we find? And I think that's a methodological question that all of us have to deal with. And I think what I try to show is that after a little bit of work, there are traces left behind by those people about themselves, and that's where they talk about it. And one of the prominent places where they talk about themselves very briefly is what we call colophons. Now, what is a colophon? Colophon is normally that part of the manuscript where a scribe talks about himself or herself, that I'm so and so, copied this particular manuscript, on this date, I finished it. But sometimes they go a bit more. After all, they crave for a little bit of fame, so they say a little bit about themselves. Sometimes they invoke certain agencies, oh, forgive me if I've made any errors, and I pray to God. Or sometimes when they talk about, I'm starting this text on this date. And that's where I started to notice a kind of a pattern which was very interesting, because when you would deal with a manuscript, of course, the language of the manuscript, of the text, depending on what the text is, the language could be Gujarati, could be Sindhi, could be Hindi, depending on what you are dealing with. But the language of the scribe was always something different than that text. So that gives you a sense of, okay, so that was the language that they were comfortable with, or that was their linguistic ability. Similarly, when it came to the kinds of agency that were invoked, okay, so those were the conceptions around which their worldview was formed. So they would invoke, God and, say Khuda or whatever. So what I try and do in this chapter is really to reconstruct the voices of those people, and I call it a forgotten voice. The other kind of main title that came to my mind was Unsung Heroes. But they are actually heroes in their own right, because more often than not, we talk about those larger figures like Peers and Dais and Sayyids who did this amazing work, about which we know next to nothing but the legendary stories. But the real people who were actually involved in the transmission of this tradition, in the crafting of this tradition, whose witness actually is in front of us more than anything else. So I think it was a small tribute to that, but also in doing so to question those images and stereotypes that have circulated for such a long time. And The most enjoyable moment is that when we look at those quotes where judge talk about this business, this mercantile credentials and lack of knowledge. Now, there's a different kind of evidence that then, in a sense, looks back at them and then questions them in a very curious way. So, more than welcome if there are more questions, but in the interest of time, that's what I try and do. And then in doing so, try and reconstruct, a sense of that scribal culture that was prevalent at that time.
The last thing which remains to be said, of course, is as Fârès had mentioned, this book is an open access book. So if any of you do want to actually read a copy, you can do so absolutely free. And you can just head to the IS website, and there are links there that will allow you to download a copy or read it online for free. So quite a revolutionary thing for us in that sense. So please do enjoy that. Thank you once again. Light refreshments are being served outside. Thank you.